The sun shone brightly over the historic royal palace as tourists flooded the courtyard, eager to capture memories of their visit. The grand structure stood tall, its walls steeped in centuries of tradition and pride. Among the many sights that drew their attention, the royal guards stood out the most. Dressed in pristine uniforms, their polished boots gleaming under the sunlight, these guards were a symbol of discipline and unwavering resolve. For many, seeing the royal guards in person was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. People marveled at their ability to remain completely still, no matter what happened around them. Some visitors tested their limits, snapping selfies close to their faces, waving their hands, or making funny gestures to see if the guards would flinch. But the guards stood firm, their expressions unreadable. In the middle of the courtyard, one particular guard caught the attention of a group of rowdy tourists. They were a noisy bunch, laughing and joking loudly as they moved from one corner of the palace to the next. Among them were a few pranksters, always looking for an opportunity to cause some mischief. When they saw the guard standing alone near a decorative pole, they exchanged mischievous grins. "Hey, let's see if we can make him move," one of them whispered, nudging his friend. The group gathered around the guard, circling him like curious children. At first, they took pictures, making exaggerated faces and poses. Then they tried to talk to him, cracking jokes and even making playful remarks. But the guard didn't respond. He stood tall, his face calm, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "Wow, he's like a statue," one of the pranksters said, impressed. "I bet he wouldn't even move if we did something crazy." The others laughed, but one of them had a daring idea. "What if we tie him to that pole?" he suggested, pointing at the decorative post behind the guard. The group hesitated for a moment, unsure if they should take things that far. But the prankster reassured them. "Come on, it's just a joke. He'll probably laugh about it later." Armed with a long scarf one of them had in their bag, they began their prank. Carefully and quietly, they looped the scarf around the guard and the pole, tying a loose knot. The guard didn't move a muscle. His stoic expression remained unchanged, even as the tourists giggled at their antics. A few people passing by stopped to watch. Some smiled, thinking it was all harmless fun, while others frowned, sensing that the prank had gone too far. One local man, familiar with the traditions of the royal guards, stepped forward and warned the group. "You shouldn't do this," he said firmly. "It's disrespectful. You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into." But the tourists only laughed, brushing off his concerns. "Relax," one of them said, waving him away. "It's just a little fun. What's the big deal?" As they stood there, laughing and taking pictures of their prank, none of them noticed the palace staff watching from a distance. Unbeknownst to them, an alarm had already been raised. Something they thought was a harmless joke was about to bring consequences they could never have imagined. The laughter of the tourists echoed through the courtyard as they admired their work. The royal guard stood tied to the decorative pole, completely still, his expression as stoic as ever. To them, it was a hilarious joke, a story they could share with their friends back home. They took more pictures, some even posing as if they were the ones giving orders to the guard. But not everyone found the situation amusing. A growing number of onlookers had gathered nearby, murmuring among themselves. A few locals shook their heads in disapproval, whispering about how disrespectful the prank was. The royal guards were more than just an attraction. They represented honor, tradition, and the history of the kingdom. What the tourists thought was a harmless joke had crossed a line. One elderly woman, who had lived near the palace her entire life, muttered to herself, "They don't understand what they've done. The guards are not to be mocked like this." Amidst the murmurs, the local man who had tried to warn the tourists earlier quietly stepped away. He didn't just leave. He was heading straight to the palace's security office. He knew something had to be done before things got even more out of hand. While the tourists continued their antics, he approached a guard stationed at the palace gates and explained the situation. The guard's expression didn't change, but he gave a firm nod and immediately reported the incident. Back in the courtyard, the tourists were still oblivious to the trouble brewing. They continued to laugh, making exaggerated jokes about the guard's silence. One of them even said, "He's like a robot. I bet he's not even real." But as they carried on, a shift in the atmosphere began to occur. The laughter from the group started to fade as they noticed the reactions of the crowd. The onlookers no longer seemed entertained. Instead, many wore serious expressions, some even looking angry. A sense of unease crept over the tourists. "Do you think we went too far?" one of them asked hesitantly. "Nah," another replied, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "It's just a joke. Besides, it's not like we hurt anyone." Suddenly, there was a low rumble of footsteps. It wasn't loud at first, but it was steady and growing closer. The tourists looked around, confused. The crowd parted slightly, and in the distance, they could see a group of royal guards marching toward them. The sight was both impressive and intimidating. An entire squad of guards, their uniforms immaculate, their movements perfectly synchronized. The leader of the squad, a commanding officer with a stern expression, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the Tide Guard, the tourists, and the crowd. Without saying a word, he gave a signal to his team. Two guards stepped forward and began untying the scarf around their colleague, treating him with the utmost respect. The tourists stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Their prank, which had seemed so funny just moments ago, now felt like a terrible mistake. The air was thick with tension as the guards finished freeing their comrade. The crowd watched silently, waiting to see what would happen next. The tourists' laughter was long gone, replaced by nervous glances and whispered apologies. They had no idea what consequences awaited them, but they were about to find out. The courtyard fell silent as the Royal Guard squad completed their task of untying their colleague. The guard, who had been tied to the pole, stood tall, his expression still as calm and collected as it had been the entire time. It was as though nothing had happened. He didn't even brush off his uniform, which remained spotless despite the prank. The tourists, who had been so full of energy and laughter earlier, now looked pale and uneasy. Their eyes darted between the guards, the crowd, and each other. None of them dared to speak, though their nervous glances said it all. What happens now? The leader of the squad, a tall man with a sharp gaze, took a step forward. His presence alone was enough to silence even the faintest murmurs in the crowd. The officer's voice, firm but calm, broke the silence. "Who among you thought it was appropriate to disrespect the honor of the Royal Guards?" he asked, his eyes locking onto the group of tourists. The question was simple, but it carried an undeniable weight. The tourists exchanged panicked looks. One of them, the bold prankster who had suggested tying the guard, hesitated before stepping forward. "It was just a joke," he mumbled, his voice shaky. "We didn't mean any harm." The officer's expression remained unchanged. "A joke," he repeated, his tone measured but clearly disapproving. "You tied one of the king's guards to a pole, a man who represents centuries of tradition and honor, and you call it a joke." The crowd murmured in agreement, their disapproval of the prank now evident. The locals, who deeply respected the guards and their role in preserving the palace's heritage, looked at the tourists with a mix of anger and disappointment. I'm sorry," the prankster stammered, his voice barely audible. "We didn't know it was such a big deal." The officer took another step closer, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestone. "Ignorance does not excuse disrespect," he said firmly. "The Royal Guards are not here for your entertainment. They stand as symbols of our nation's pride and discipline. Their duty is not to amuse you, but to protect the palace and uphold its traditions." The other tourists began to mumble apologies, their earlier bravado completely gone. One of them tried to explain. "We thought it would be funny. We didn't mean to offend anyone." But the officer raised a hand, silencing them. "You may not have intended harm, but your actions have consequences. You have shown disrespect, not only to the guard you tied up, but to our entire heritage." At his signal, 2 other guards approached the group. "You will follow us to the palace security office," the officer instructed. "There, you will explain your actions and face the consequences of your behavior." The tourists didn't dare argue. Heads hung low, they followed the guards as the crowd looked on. Some people shook their heads, while others whispered about how the tourists were lucky they weren't being punished more harshly. As the group was led away, the freed guard resumed his position, standing tall and proud. The crowd dispersed slowly, many taking with them a newfound respect for the unwavering discipline and dignity of the royal guards. The prank, which the tourists thought would be a moment of fun, had turned into a sobering lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The tourists were escorted through the gates of the royal palace by the guards, their once lively spirits replaced by heavy silence. Each step felt like a weight on their shoulders as they passed through the grand corridors. The walls were lined with portraits of past monarchs, their faces solemn and imposing, as if silently watching over the situation. As they walked, the group couldn't help but exchange nervous glances. One of the pranksters whispered, "Do you think they're going to arrest us?" His voice trembled, betraying his earlier bravado. "Stop talking," another whispered back, her eyes darting to the guards walking beside them. "Just don't make it worse." The guards remained silent and composed, their disciplined march echoing through the halls. They finally reached a room that appeared to be a security office. It wasn't intimidating in appearance, but the atmosphere inside was heavy. The officer who had confronted them earlier gestured for the tourists to sit down on the wooden benches lining the wall. The tourists obeyed without question, their gazes fixed on the floor. The officer stood before them, his arms crossed, his sharp gaze sweeping over the group. "You should consider yourselves lucky," he began, his voice firm yet calm. "In many places, disrespecting the royal guards could lead to severe consequences. But here, we believe in education over punishment. I will give you an opportunity to reflect on your actions and understand why what you did was unacceptable." One of the tourists, a young woman who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, hesitantly raised her hand. The officer nodded, allowing her to speak. "We really didn't mean to offend anyone," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "We just thought it would be funny. But I guess we didn't think about how important the guards are to your culture." The officer's expression softened slightly. "It's not just about culture," he explained. "The royal guards represent discipline, respect, and duty. They undergo rigorous training to stand as symbols of this nation's values. Their silence is not weakness, it is strength and dedication. Mocking them is not only disrespectful to the individuals, but to everything they stand for." The tourists listened intently, their regret growing with each word. The prankster who had tied the scarf around the guard finally spoke up, his voice filled with guilt. I'm sorry. I didn't know it would hurt anyone. I just thought it was a harmless joke." The officer nodded, his tone firm but not unkind. "Apologies are a start, but understanding is more important. Disrespecting someone for your own amusement, even if it seems harmless, is never acceptable." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You will each write a formal apology to the guard you disrespected. In your letters, I expect you to reflect on what you've learned today." The tourists exchanged uncertain glances, but nodded in agreement. As they were handed pens and paper, the weight of their actions became clear. What had started as a thoughtless prank had turned into a lesson they wouldn't forget. The guards watched over them silently, their presence a reminder of the honor and discipline they embodied. For the tourists, this experience would serve as a humbling reminder to respect the traditions and values of others. The room was quiet, except for the sound of pens scratching against paper. The tourists sat in a line, their heads down as they worked on their letters of apology. The once boisterous group now looked small and humbled, their earlier laughter and energy completely gone. Each of them was deep in thought, carefully considering their words as the weight of the situation sank in. One of the tourists, a young man named Liam, paused and glanced at the guard who had been tied to the pole. The guard stood nearby, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Liam couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he remembered how confident and amused he had been when they carried out their prank. Liam turned back to his letter and wrote, "I am truly sorry for my actions today. I now realize that what I thought was a joke was actually disrespectful and hurtful. You showed incredible patience and professionalism, and I regret not recognizing the dignity of your role sooner." Beside him, another tourist, Mia, was also deep in thought. She had initially gone along with the prank, thinking it was harmless fun. Now she felt ashamed. In her letter, she wrote, "To the guard I disrespected, I want to sincerely apologize. You stood with honor while we acted thoughtlessly. I will carry this lesson with me and treat others with more respect in the future." The commanding officer stood at the front of the room, silently observing. He didn't rush them, knowing the importance of allowing the group to process what had happened. The other guards stood by as well, their presence a constant reminder of the pride and discipline they represented. Once the tourists had finished writing, the officer collected the letters and carefully read through them. He nodded slightly as he reviewed each one, satisfied that the group was beginning to understand the seriousness of their actions. After reading the last letter, the officer addressed the group. "I appreciate your efforts to reflect on your behavior," he said. "Apologies alone cannot undo disrespect, but they can be the first step toward change. I hope this experience will stay with you and remind you to always consider the impact of your actions on others." He handed the letters to one of the guards, who would later deliver them to the guard who had been tied. The tourists watched as the letters were taken away, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering guilt. The officer continued, his tone slightly softer now. "You will not face further punishment, as we believe you have learned an important lesson. However, let this be a reminder that respect is not optional. It is essential, no matter where you go or who you meet." The tourists nodded quietly, grateful for the officer's fairness, but still feeling the weight of their mistake. As they were escorted out of the security office, they passed through the palace's grand halls once more. This time, the portraits of the past monarchs seemed to stare down at them with quiet judgment. When they returned to the courtyard, they glanced at the royal guards still standing at their posts. For the first time, they truly saw them, not as statues or props, but as people who carried the responsibility of tradition, honor, and discipline. As the group left the palace, they promised themselves they would never forget what had happened that day. It wasn't just about a prank gone wrong. It was a lesson in respect that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As the tourists exited the palace grounds, the air felt heavier. The playful energy they had entered with was long gone, replaced by a quiet sense of shame and reflection. Each step they took felt like a reminder of the lesson they had just learned. The crowd in the courtyard had dispersed, leaving behind only the royal guards, still standing tall and unwavering at their posts. Liam, one of the pranksters, glanced over his shoulder at the guard they had tied to the pole. The guard stood in his usual position, as if nothing had ever happened. His composure was remarkable, and Liam couldn't help but admire the discipline it must have taken to remain calm during the entire ordeal. He thought about the letter he had written and hoped it would reach the guard, though he wasn't sure if it could ever truly make up for his actions. As the group walked toward the main gate, Mia broke the silence. "Do you think they'll forgive us?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," Liam replied honestly. "But I think it's more about us understanding what we did wrong. We can't expect them to just forget what happened." Another tourist, Mark, who had been quieter throughout the experience, finally spoke up. "You know, I think this is the first time I've really thought about how much effort goes into traditions like this. Those guards stand there every day, no matter what, and we treated it like it was a joke." The group nodded in agreement. It was clear that their perspective had shifted. What they had once seen as just a tourist attraction now carried a deeper meaning. The guards weren't just there for decoration. They represented something much bigger, a commitment to honor, duty, and respect. As they reached the gate, a local man who had witnessed the entire incident approached them. It was the same man who had warned them earlier about their prank. He gave them a long, thoughtful look before speaking. "I see that you've learned something today," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Respecting others, especially those who dedicate their lives to serving something greater than themselves, is not just a lesson for today. It's something you should carry with you always. Liam nodded. "We understand now. Thank you for trying to stop us earlier. We should have listened to you." The man's expression softened slightly. "It's good that you've reflected on your actions. Remember this lesson, and make sure it shapes how you treat others in the future." With that, the man turned and walked away, leaving the group to their thoughts. The tourists stood silently for a moment, looking back at the palace one last time. The towering structure, the guards, and the entire atmosphere seemed different to them now, more meaningful, more deserving of respect. As they left the palace grounds, they didn't laugh or joke as they had before. Instead, they walked quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. They had come seeking fun and adventure, but they were leaving with something much more valuable, a lesson in humility and the importance of respecting traditions and the people who uphold them. For Liam, Mia, and the rest of the group, this experience would remain with them for years to come. It wasn't the photos or the sights they would remember most. It was the realization that respect was not a gift to be given lightly, but a responsibility to uphold wherever they went. The tourists continued walking through the bustling streets outside the palace. Though the sights and sounds of the city were lively and colorful, their mood remained quiet and reflective. The lesson they had learned inside the palace weighed heavily on their minds, and none of them felt like joking or taking pictures anymore. Mia broke the silence, her voice soft but thoughtful. "Do you think they'll ever read our letters? The guard, I mean." Liam shrugged, his gaze distant. "I don't know. But even if they don't, I'm glad we wrote them. It's not just about him reading it. It's about us understanding what we did." Mark, who had been the most reserved during the ordeal, nodded in agreement. "I think this was more than just an apology. It made me realize how little we think about the meaning behind things we see. Those guards weren't just there for tourists like us. They were standing for something much bigger." Mia smiled faintly. "I guess we learned more today than we expected. I came here thinking it was just a fun trip, but now it feels like we've been reminded of something important." The group's conversation drifted to the traditions they had witnessed during their travels. They began to talk about the importance of respecting other cultures, their customs, and the people who uphold them. It was a humbling realization, and one that made them feel both regretful and hopeful. As they reached a small cafe nearby, they decided to sit down and reflect. The cafe was cozy, with wooden tables and a warm atmosphere. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the group ordered drinks, hoping to take a moment to process everything that had happened. While they sat, an older man at a nearby table overheard their conversation. He had a kind face and seemed intrigued by their story. After a moment, he leaned over and spoke. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you talking about the royal guards at the palace?" The group nodded, and Liam replied, "Yeah, we made a mistake earlier. We didn't show them the respect they deserved, but I think we've learned our lesson now." The man smiled kindly. "That's good to hear. You know, those guards aren't just trained to stand still. They go through years of rigorous training, not only to protect the palace, but to symbolize our nation's strength and pride. What you saw today wasn't just discipline, it was devotion." His words made the group feel even more reflective. Maya asked, "Have you ever been a part of that tradition?" The man chuckled. "Yes, many years ago. I served as one of the royal guards in my youth, and let me tell you, it's not easy to stand there for hours, no matter what happens around you. but it teaches you something important: patience, strength, and the value of representing something greater than yourself. The group listened intently, appreciating the man's perspective. His words gave them an even deeper understanding of the importance of the guard's role. They realized that their earlier actions had not only disrespected the guards, but also the values they represented. As they finished their drinks and thanked the man for his insight, the group made a silent vow. They would carry this experience with them wherever they went, treating people and cultures with the respect they deserved. It was a lesson they would never forget. The tourists were escorted through the gates of the royal palace by the guards, their once lively spirits replaced by heavy silence. Each step felt like a weight on their shoulders as they passed through the grand corridors. The walls were lined with portraits of past monarchs, their faces solemn and imposing, as if silently watching over the situation. As they walked, the group couldn't help but exchange nervous glances. One of the pranksters whispered, "Do you think they're going to arrest us?" His voice trembled, betraying his earlier bravado. "Stop talking," another whispered back, her eyes darting to the guards walking beside them. "Just don't make it worse." The guards remained silent and composed, their disciplined march echoing through the halls. They finally reached a room that appeared to be a security office. It wasn't intimidating in appearance, but the atmosphere inside was heavy. The officer who had confronted them earlier gestured for the tourists to sit down on the wooden benches lining the wall. The tourists obeyed without question, their gazes fixed on the floor. The officer stood before them, his arms crossed, his sharp gaze sweeping over the group. "You should consider yourselves lucky," he began, his voice firm yet calm. "In many places, disrespecting the royal guards could lead to severe consequences. But here, we believe in education over punishment. I will give you an opportunity to reflect on your actions and understand why what you did was unacceptable." One of the tourists, a young woman who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, hesitantly raised her hand. The officer nodded, allowing her to speak. "We really didn't mean to offend anyone," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "We just thought it would be funny. But I guess we didn't think about how important the guards are to your culture." The officer's expression softened slightly. "It's not just about culture," he explained. "The royal guards represent discipline, respect, and duty. They undergo rigorous training to stand as symbols of this nation's values. Their silence is not weakness, it is strength and dedication. Mocking them is not only disrespectful to the individuals, but to everything they stand for." The tourists listened intently, their regret growing with each word. The prankster who had tied the scarf around the guard finally spoke up, his voice filled with guilt. I'm sorry. I didn't know it would hurt anyone. I just thought it was a harmless joke." The officer nodded, his tone firm but not unkind. "Apologies are a start, but understanding is more important. Disrespecting someone for your own amusement, even if it seems harmless, is never acceptable." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You will each write a formal apology to the guard you disrespected. In your letters, I expect you to reflect on what you've learned today." The tourists exchanged uncertain glances, but nodded in agreement. As they were handed pens and paper, the weight of their actions became clear. What had started as a thoughtless prank had turned into a lesson they wouldn't forget. The guards watched over them silently, their presence a reminder of the honor and discipline they embodied. For the tourists, this experience would serve as a humbling reminder to respect the traditions and values of others.